This is JJ Pianki of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign interviewing Nick Osborne on August 9th, 2017 at the Veterans Center on campus. Where and when were you born?
Livermore, California, June 3rd, 1978.
Who are or were your parents, and what are or were their occupations?
My father, Howard, and my mother, Denise, and my dad did a combination of, he was a carpet cleaner, he was a maintenance man, and then he also became a school teacher. And my mom worked as an admin assistant, and she also worked as like a manager of various retail stores.
Do you have any siblings?
I have an older sister, Becky.
Okay. And do they serve in the military?
No.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was a school teacher, and I had just been accepted into a master's program in California, and it was shortly after 9/11 happened, and I decided that I wanted to have a more proactive role, and military service seemed like just the right fit at that time.
What branch of the military did you serve in?
I served in the Coast Guard, in the reserves, and on active duty for a total of about 8 years.
And you enlisted?
Enlisted, and then I became an officer. So I went in, enlisted, and then I finished my master's degree, and my command said, we want to send you to officer candidate school. So I went and was commissioned on August 4th, 2004.
Okay. Why did you choose the Coast Guard?
I think being from California and just being a lover of the water, it was just a natural, like, wow, what's that all about? I didn't know a whole lot about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is actually smaller than the entire New York Police Department. And it was something that at the time, after 9/11, they were moving into so many different areas, from expeditionary warfare to law enforcement to border protection to search and rescue to what we call the duck scrubbers who clean up after big oil spills. So it was just this huge, diverse organization that fascinated me. And I just thought, being small, and they also have the highest standards for admissions, that was also, could I get in, was kind of something that drove me as well.
You wanted a challenge.
I wanted a challenge.
What makes their standards higher? Is it intelligence, physical fitness, something else?
So because they're so small, they have such fewer jobs available, and their ASVAB scores, which is what you have to take, it's the standardized battery to get in the military. They have the highest cutoff point, or the highest minimum standards, and then there's also a very high concentration of enlisted service members that have at least a bachelor's degree, so it's also a very highly educated branch. And just sort of the technicalities of the work. Being on the ocean, you always have that inherent danger of if you're at war and this and that, but just being in nature and on the ocean, and what we like to see in the Coast Guard, when people are coming in, we're going out. So you're constantly dealing with so many natural elements that you have to pay attention to.
So what happened when you departed for training camp and during your early days of training? What was that like?
So I had just taken my first international backpacking trip to Southeast Asia, and I came back and I left for basic training or boot camp at Cape May, New Jersey, and I really didn't know what to expect. It was actually pretty challenging. It was a great training, so I did that, and then I ended up doing on-the-job training for port security. And so once I completed all of that training, then I formally reported to my unit.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall your instructors, and if so, what were they like?
So that environment is they're constantly yelling at you and in their face. I do remember when I went to OCS later on, which was another boot camp environment, there was a chief warrant officer named, I think it was Bousimone, and he was just an unbelievably awesome guy, and he had so many years in the military and had served in so many different ways, but he was also just somebody that when he talked to us, he was just very real. He would share anecdotes about his life, and I always walked away thinking he was pretty awesome.
Did you receive any specialized training, and if so, what?
A lot. Gosh. So I trained in port security, and then I went to boarding team member school to be part of a law enforcement team that boards ships, and then I went to boarding officer school, and then I went to vertical insertion school to rappel out of helicopters, and then I went to intelligence training, and then I went through, I got assigned to a naval coastal warfare unit, which was an expeditionary unit where we trained for almost 5 months in tactics and preparing for war and stuff like that. So yeah, quite a bit of training.
A little bit.
Yeah.
How did you adapt to military life, including the physical regimen, barracks, food, and social life?
I was always pretty physically fit, and I was always, people kind of joke when they come in my office, they're like, wow, it's tidy in here. I was always like, I never had a problem being organized and kind of keeping things in a certain way. So I liked the structure. I liked the discipline. I liked that the military is not big on excuse making, and they're also not big on people feeling sorry for themselves. And so when you're in the moment where it sucks, which is, you're cold, you're wet, you're hungry or whatever, you don't get the, we're going to come here and kind of coddle you. It's like you need to learn to deal with it. And I think that looking back, that those types of experiences, we don't really give people, particularly in America, enough of those opportunities. And I think it teaches a lot about who you are as a person. It teaches you to be resilient. It teaches you to, what we say, quote unquote, adapt and overcome.
Okay. Where were you stationed?
So my first unit was this little, real small Marine Safety Detachment up in Humboldt County, California, and I was only there for a brief period of time, and then I was down in the Bay Area at what was originally called Marine Safety Office San Francisco, and then it later became known as Sector San Francisco. Yerba Buena Island, which is literally underneath the Bay Bridge on the water, and then I was assigned to a Naval Coastal Warfare unit out of San Diego, and that's the unit that I deployed with overseas.
Okay. If you went abroad, what were some of your memories of that experience?
So I spent almost a year abroad, primarily in Kuwait and in some parts of Iraq, and it was, I think when we landed, it was like 128 degrees and humid. So I remember it being hot. I remember just not knowing what to expect on the flight over there. We had a layover in Rota, Spain for 4 days, which kind of made it harder because like the whole buildup was, what are we going to be doing over there? What is it going to be like? Is it going to be dangerous? Is it going to be boring? Is it going to be, it was just going into the unknown. And I remember getting there and talking to the unit that we were replacing, and a lot of them were like, yeah, you've got to find some ways to occupy your free time or you'll go crazy here. And thankfully I'm a reader, but just, looking at a year of your life of being taken out of your normal routine and working weird hours and being with just the most diverse group of people and having to make it work is what I remember. And I mean, honestly, I look back and it was one of the best experiences of my life. It really was good.
What made it, so you just said it was the best experience of your life.
Mm-hmm.
What made it the best experience of your life? Was it, trying new foods and experiencing a new culture, even though, it was an active military situation? Was it being with people? Was it just a job that you loved doing what you were doing?
Yeah.
Like, can you tell me more about that?
All good questions, JJ. My mentor was a Navy SEAL, and I worked for him basically one-on-one for the whole period. And, next to my dad, he's probably one of the male figures who's left the biggest impression on my life. So just working, his name was Del Griffith, working for Del, and which is funnily, that was John Candy's name in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So working for Del was just so amazing. Just, he taught me so much about the military, about leadership, about tactics, all that stuff. But I think I had traveled a good bit before I went overseas. I like being in other cultures. There's a lot about the Muslim culture I really like, and we worked very closely with host nations, so other other foreign militaries, and I really enjoyed that. And you know, one example is one of our jobs was to bring in the big warships that bring all the war supplies into theater. And so you're talking billions and billions of dollars. So when these things leave, you've got a lot of eyes tracking them. And our job was to make sure that the security was in place on the water, but then once they were actually in port, to make sure it was offloaded safely and then convoyed up into Iraq safely. So it was 150 people are part of this process. And you have to know what each group's role is, and you have to get into a rhythm where you're constantly aware of what that picture is. And you know, one of the issues was that the host nation forces would support some of these missions, and they were always late, like just notoriously late. So it's kind of like, you know, a question of how do you, quote unquote, task another foreign military on their turf and keep the peace, right? So that, you know, as a 27 or a 28-year-old man, it was like, wow, how do you do that? And so some of it was, you know, we would go to these meetings, and which was just kind of like in a shithole, ratty, like little spot, and you'd roll in there, and there would be like a sheik and, you know, some local dudes who were probably corrupt and, you know, had been bribed in some capacity. And everybody's sitting around, nobody's talking, we're all smoking shisha, you know, tobacco out of a hookah pipe, drinking tea, and it's like 2 hours before somebody even says a word. And then we have to diplomatically craft what it is that we need from them without, you know, creating some sort of cultural disrespect. So, you know, just one story like that.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
If you were on the front lines, what combat action did you witness?
Wasn't in the front lines. I'd say I was in the right behind the front lines, so like the second line. Hardest part was I was on 3 Angel flights where we loaded, you know, dead bodies on planes. So I did 3 of those. I met just randomly Oliver North was over there filming his show for Fox News at the time, and deceased service members are escorted back with an escort officer, and since he was a retired Marine Corps colonel, he happened to be the liaison officer. And so, you know, here we are, we're tired, we're obviously in a pretty stressful situation, and you know, I look over and I'm like, how do I know that guy? And then I remember, like, at 9 years old watching TV and seeing that famous picture of him when he was being grilled for the whole Iran-Contra thing. And I'm just like, wow, that's Oliver North. And so he came over and we chatted for like 10 minutes, and it was just so random, but it was also just really human because of the circumstances of why we were there together, and to just sort of engage with him in that way without any sort of political you know, influence. We were there to show respect and to honor people who had been killed in service, and I think it kept our interaction pretty authentic.
Cool. If you were, so what were your duties, since you were not sort of in combat? What kind of, generally, you know, you talked about working on moving materiel.
Yep.
What else did you do?
So we would synthesize intel information that would come in from a lot of different sources and try to figure out what was credible and what wasn't. So everything from IEDs that were being developed to people who were working within our camp who may have been, you know, working for the enemy, escorting the HVAs, the high-value assets, the warships. That was a real big part of it. And then also, this is where I got to use some of my Coast Guard work. I should preface that I was only one of about 15 Coast Guard members over there at the time, so we were this very small group, and typically people would see us and see our uniform and be like, what the hell are you guys doing out here? You know, how'd you end up here? What boat did you get on? And so the other part of what we would do, at the time we were over there, some of the terror groups were putting IEDs onto cars, and then they were putting them on boats and transporting them to different areas, and then they would drive off in the cars with the cars already wired. So we would actually go out and search these ships and search their cargo. And that was, when I first started, I thought, like, that's kind of dangerous. You know, here we are as a small group of 8 to 10 guys boarding ships, you know, out at sea in the northern Arabian Gulf with really no clear backup plan if things go south, and you're also then dealing with different cultures, so you're dealing with language barriers, but you're also dealing with people who, in their home country, law enforcement or military may be corrupt, so they're immediately like freaked out that here we are. So you're having to again sift through all these experiences, and keep some sort of semblance of professionalism and peace, and doing what you need to do to make sure you accomplish the objective.
So was the Coast Guard pulled into the theater because of the port security aspect, that they had
Yep.
more experience with port security than
Yeah.
the Navy
Yep.
or the Marines or somebody else?
So the port security and the boardings are one of our real areas of strength and specialty, and then we're also in the Coast Guard. Once you make E4, so enlisted, it's a petty officer, 3rd class is the rank. Then you are eligible to go to a law enforcement school and then have law enforcement power. So we're actually, believe it or not, the largest law enforcement agency in the world when you factor in all the people in the Coast Guard who have the ability to enforce federal law.
Didn't know
Yeah, I didn't either. I just looked it up on Wikipedia about 10 minutes ago. I'm just kidding.
that. If you saw any combat, how did you feel when witnessing casualties or destruction?
I witnessed some casualties, but it was after the fact. Good question. I think that before we all deployed, we knew that there would be the likelihood of seeing, death in some form. And I'm not trying to be Johnny Tough Guy here. It didn't bother me because I think that my own personal beliefs are, I personally believe in reincarnation. I believe the soul is eternal. I believe that, we rent this body for a certain amount of time and then we go on. So I've never been fazed by death. Even members of my family who have died. My grandmother just died recently, and I've never felt bogged down by death. I had a woman that I was engaged to in the Coast Guard who died in service. I think that it was just something we knew kind of went with the territory. And I think that anytime you join the military in a post 9/11 reality, you have to just get your mind ready that you're probably going to be in different parts of the world and see things that are very different from what we see here. The Angel flights were harder because I think that part of what bothered me about those were that we knew about the deceased before their families did. And so I remember like loading the coffins and you could smell their bodies, and you've got the flags draped, and just thinking like somewhere down the line, some folks are arriving at somebody's house and they're coming out, and whether it's a husband, wife, children, whoever's there, they're getting probably the worst news of their life. So yeah, that's never an easy thing to think about.
Yeah. What kinds of friendships and camaraderie did you form while you were serving, and with whom?
What I love about the military is you take just the biggest hodgepodge group. It's kind of like the Bad News Bears, You just take this group and you throw people together, and it's like, okay, we can be at each other's throats, or we can learn to make it work. And there's people you connect with more so than others. But there was this guy named Vargas who was from East LA, grew up in a hardcore gang environment, most of his and covered in tattoos, and he would routinely put on panties with a thong and just kind of stroll around the barracks. And we had this high-ranking general who was visiting from the Army, and he was kind of your stereotypical stuffy type. And so at the end of the meeting, he was like, boys, would you like to get a picture? And Vargas goes, General, I'd like a picture sitting on your lap. And the general's like, well, how about one, shaking my hand, son? And he's like, no. He's like, I'd really like one sitting on your lap. And just totally weirded out this general, who then got totally pissed off and called our chain of command later on and, raised Cain. And obviously the avalanche started rolling down the mountain. But it's, it's things like that you just have to keep your humor intact. And there's always somebody there who seems to. But when you're training that hard, when you're not on a Monday through Friday, you're not on a 9 to 5, going back to the being in the suck, it really brings you together. And I think that the camaraderie and the bonds of the military are one of the reasons why the military is for so many people like a sacred memory, is because you look back on those people and that time in your life and you're like, you know what, it wasn't always easy, but I was going through it with people that were just really top notch.
How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
Well, today's military now, with internet, I had a phone call, like I called my family maybe once a month, and I would email them typically a couple times a week, it would depend. There was always like pretty clear guidelines about what we could say and what we couldn't. OPSEC is a real big, OPSEC, operational security, is a real biggie, so you could never put anything in your correspondence that would give away like what we were doing or where we were. Family members would typically send care packages, and what we would do is we would just kind of like dump them out and then consolidate. So, people would get DVDs or books and beef jerky and M&Ms and all this stuff, and so all the food stuff we would just kind of divvy up. And then we had so many DVDs that by the time we left, we had over 1,000 DVDs that we basically just made our own like DVD library and our own book library. And then we left it for the next group that came in to replace us. And usually, some family members wrote letters if they weren't tech savvy. But I intentionally didn't want to have a lot of contact with family because I felt like every time I reached out or I heard more about home, something inside of me kept me away from where I was, and I needed to be fully present over there. I had a responsibility of people that I was responsible for their care and their welfare and a mission, and sleeping six hours a night, maybe, pumping 7 days a week. I didn't want the distractions of back home taking me away from that environment, because I think it would have been harder for me.
So when you did write home, or call, obviously there's a lot of stuff you're like, a lot of stuff that's blacked out you can't talk about. So what were some of the things that you did talk about? Did you talk about weather, food, something you read? Like, how did you make that connection to mom and dad or friends, even though you can't talk about a lot of stuff?
It would depend. The hard part is the family is at home watching the news, and it's like so-and-so killed here, 4 Marines killed here, and so they're constantly seeing and being bombarded by images of death and carnage, in the neighborhood that your loved one is in. So I would always just kind of reaffirm how safe we were, and that it's boring, it's just Groundhog Day, and then I would also bring in kind of like I was accepted in the University of California's at Davis's doctoral program, and then I had to defer for my deployment. So I would always kind of go back to like what my life was going to be like when I got home, and so I think especially for certain members of my family, like my sister, it really pacified them and reminded them that this is just a brief part of my life. This is not, I'm not going to be over here for the rest of my life, and I'm not going to be in this environment. This is just a moment in time, but there is this whole other life that's waiting for me that I'm going to return to and continue on.
Mm-hmm. When you were in the what did you do for recreation or when you were off duty?
So we would work out, we would, you can't have alcohol over there, doesn't mean that we didn't have it. We would have our non-alcoholic beverages. A group of us would get together and watch a movie. We'd watch like corny, like 80s, 90s martial art flicks, You'd always find somebody who was like, oh, I love that movie. And be like, oh, kick ass, let's do it Friday. Like, all right, So you would kind of find people with these common interests. I read a lot. I read a lot. I've been reading for years, and so it was just something that I enjoyed, and that was about it. We didn't have a lot of time off. We were typically on 9 days on and then 2 days off, and for those 2 days you're doing sometimes administrative stuff, kind of like what we do at the university, like sexual harassment training and all the different trainings. You do that in the military too. So on those 2 days off, you'd be doing like your laundry and any of your administrative duties or calling home. It went by fast. It really did. Yeah, it went by pretty fast.
How long were you there?
I actually got to go home for a week. So I was over there for September, October, November, December, January. At the 6-month mark, they flew me to Washington, D.C. and my girlfriend at the time for a week for an award I won. And so I got to go out there on a all-expenses-paid trip, which was just kind of like a dream. And then I came back, and then I was there from January till end of May. Yeah.
So about 9 months.
Yeah,
Is that about
9 or
right?
10 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like right around 10 months. Sounds about right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you talked about you did a lot of reading. What were some of the things you're reading? So you were reading for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
What were you reading?
It's funny that people when they like, oh, you're a veteran. Oh, have you read the General Custer's bio? And I'm like, so like I never read military stuff. I read John Krakauer's Into the Wild, and just loved it. And I read that. I read a couple of other books that have to do with like Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. So those are some things that I remember reading. I read William Burroughs, some of the beatnik writers, and I've read a book on Wicca. Like Wicca and astrology, shit I'm into, and people would walk by and come like, what? Like, what are you doing? Like, are you a witch? Like, what are you reading that for? So I'd say that was probably the biggest thing I would ask people to send me, or I'd send a book list, and and then it was awesome. You get this care package. You're like, wow, they sent it. Great.
Thanks, Mom and Dad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amazon.
What particular book would you say influenced your life the most, and why?
One book? Probably Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. Yeah.
How come?
I'd say because his contribution was the concept of the monomyth, the one myth, and I think that I agree that when you look at, obviously I'm not nearly as well read and researched as he was, but when you look at all of the deep stories, whether they're religious or whether they're just more profound stories connected to various cultures, the symbolism and similarities is striking. And so it's essentially this one story. It's just that story gets cut up and diced and then, sort of culturally manipulated, or there's a spin on it that makes it unique to that culture. And when I read it, it was just like this wave went over me of like, yeah, that just makes perfect sense to me. And then, going back to with the hero's journey, the quest, that's so much a part of this story. I see it in my own life, but then I would also start hearing like pieces of how those around me would share parts. Like, I feel like my life is a journey, or, this part of my life right now is really horrible, or this part of my life's really great. So kind of like seeing where they are in the part of the journey, and then the people that would come into their life in those moments. It's like that cliched story. I had $5 in my pocket and I was at a bus stop and I met this person, and here I am 5 years later and I'm a millionaire and my life's changed. I really do believe in the magic of the universe, and I think that story really gave more of a contextualized spin and reinforcement of things that I've maybe always felt or intuited even as a young man.
Cool. Did you use libraries when you were in the service? Why or why not?
No. The only libraries I was familiar with were the public libraries, and I think that, it never really occurred to me. I was always a guy that would order books. I like to write on my books and bend them and throw them in the air. So, I think I only saw, sorry, I only saw libraries, I think maybe as places to go and check out books. So it wasn't until later on, especially coming here to U of I, realizing more of what like libraries do. And so, the libraries never really popped on my radar in the military.
So, you talked earlier about leaving this big DVD collection and book collection behind.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say, I mean, not necessarily you personally, but that your unit or your group, would you say that there was sort of an informal library that kind of formed?
There was actually a formal library that was later built because we had so many things coming in, and then our unit was also situated with an Army unit that was over there. Mm-hmm. And so actually it was it was a project from one of our senior officers. Part of it is he didn't have a job, but he took it upon himself, and he actually worked with some builders over there and built, it was probably the size of this office, and it became our base library. Yeah, which I thought was one of the coolest things, that he did that.
Mm-hmm. And so how did that operate? Did people just come in, take what they want, read it, return it,
Honor
grab
system,
something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was like an informal rule, like don't take out more than 3 things at one time, and then, return things when you're done with them. And, it flowed. And it was in it was near the gym, it was near the chow hall, it was in a location that was just really, really cool. His name was Captain Vanden Bosch. That was his name. He was the librarian. Yeah.
Nice. How did you return home?
So we, our redeployment home, part of the beauty of the military is all the rumors. The good, the bad, the ugly. Hey, we're going to Afghanistan next. Hey, we got stop lost. Hey, we're going home early. Hey. So the military runs on rumors. America runs on Duncans, and the military runs on rumors. And there's that saying in the military, loose lips sink ships, because, it creates so many issues. And we finally got our date of our folks coming in, and what's funny is when you arrive in country, your uniforms are new, and then by the time you're getting ready to go home, 10, 11 months later, they're pretty worn down. And so all of a sudden you see in the chow hall these crisp, green, nice haircuts, handsome lads coming to replace us, and you go, thank God they're here. And so the day that they actually showed up was like, okay, it's no longer a rumor. And then at that point, we got our go-home date. And it's kind of like this, look, my hair's standing up. This surge of energy just goes through you. Maybe it's the closest thing to like getting a parole date in prison. It's kind of like, I'm leaving this total institution. I'm leaving all these restrictions. I'm leaving, this place where there's not a lot to do, and it's hot, and it's dangerous, and all these things that I've been dwelling on and dreaming about and prepping for. It's I can touch it now. It's reachable. And so we got our date, and then they took us to I think it was Ali Salim, and we had our chartered planes came in, and we went through, and a lot of stand around time, just kind of like 10, 12 hours of just hanging out. You don't care, and everybody's on a high, and everybody's feeling good. And then we boarded. We stopped off in Germany for a brief layover, and our commanding officer came on and said, nobody can have more than 2 alcoholic beverages, and we're all like this to the monitor, and we were out there just drinking like a bunch of wild men, and we got shit faced. And then we got on the plane, and everybody's like passing whiskey bottles and beer, and dudes are throwing up, and you're like, God, this is great. And then we landed in Bangor, Maine. And there's this group in Maine that actually goes and greets all of the service members that are coming back, and so the pilot announced once we were in U.S. airspace, so everybody's all like, ah, and then we landed in Bangor, Maine. None of us had been asleep at that point for over 24 hours. We go right to the bar. What do? We drank again, and then we got back on the plane, and we landed in San Diego, and we're like the Walking Dead, coming out, and everybody's family. My family was not there. I asked that they not be there, but everybody's families were there, and we were basically cut loose. It was a dream. Because from the fatigue, the booze, the just coming down from the year, it was like being in an altered reality. And I went back to my hotel room on base, and I was 4 o'clock and I just collapsed on the bed, and I woke up, and it was like, 3 in the morning, and I was wide awake, and like I remember waking up going like, where am I? And then being like, oh my God, it's over. Like this isn't a dream, it's over. Like we're done. And then the irony is I flipped on the TV and I was channel surfing, and on the Discovery Channel they were doing this whole segment on EOD, which are explosive dudes. And the guy that they're interviewing was one of the guys that was training us in the Mojave Desert right before we left. And I'm just like, like, like what? So yeah, I remember that. Like, it's like I couldn't leave it. It was just right there.
How come you asked that your family not be there?
I'm one of those guys that like, I don't like being in situations where people are being very emotional in a public space. Not that I don't respect it, but just for me, I'm uncomfortable by it. And I told my family I just needed my own time to just get back and readjust. And so my cousin Corinne, who I've told you about, lived in Santa Cruz at the time. Mm-hmm. And so we had a 96 pass, which is a 96-hour pass, a 4-day pass. And I, was in San Diego, and I went to the zoo. And I just kind of like walked around and got Starbucks and just went to the beach and just kind of really had some. I'm a very personal, I'm a person who requires a lot of personal time in my life. And in the military and deployed, you don't get any of it. You're living with a bunch of dudes, and you're working around a bunch of people, and you're constantly bombarded with people. And I needed that time to just, silence all that noise and be by myself. And then I went and saw my cousin, and then I started to kind of reintegrate, reaching out to family members, and they were all totally cool with it.
What would you say was the toughest part about being overseas? I mean, was it the danger aspect? Was it the psychological stress for you? Was it the job? Was it something else entirely, like you hated the food?
The omelets were awesome, actually. The breakfast was awesome. I would say the hardest part for me was just the Groundhog Day. That when you're especially there early on, and you're going through the routine, and you're tired, and you're just kind of, God, we're a month into this, and we've got 9 more to go. I think it was just the monotony. My job was, though, I had more diversity in my role, which was cool. But I think it was the monotony and just the feeling like your life has been put on pause for basically a year. That basically, including those 5 months of pre-deployment training where we were highly, pumping full time, just to like leave JJ's life, for a year and a half. Or you put pause and all the stuff you want to do, and now you're like, I can't even give energy to that, and my life and focus is now this. That can be a lot to manage, I think it's the closest thing to being in a total institution that I've ever experienced. I have friends and people I know, family members who have been incarcerated, and or people who have been in hospitals for mental health issues and stuff like that, and it's that loss of freedom. Mm-hmm. And then just being in a fully regimented, structured routine where you don't really feel like you have full ownership of your life and yourself.
Mm-hmm. How were you received by your family and community when you came back?
Like a hero, or hero. It is kind of that joke that we say here about everyone's either Chris Kyle or walking around with PTSD. And but my family was really proud. I think they were proud that. We did it. I won the Officer of the Year for the Coast Guard, and that's why I went out to DC. So there's the newspaper at home did a big write-up, and so there's things like that they were proud of. But I think that they were just proud that I did it, that we all came back safe, and for the most part we all came back very similar to who we were when we left. Whereas not everybody does that. Some people come back and they can be totally different people.
How did you readjust to civilian life?
I left active duty and I went into the reserves, and then I started at Davis that summer, and I got hired at the VA also at that time. And I think that I went to work, I went back to school, and I just kind of, the military went from being my everyday job to my 1 weekend a month job, and that was a phenomenal unit, that last unit I was in. So it was just kind of like I was tapering away from the military, and more of my life was being filled by my civilian interests and passions.
Have you remained in contact with or reunited with fellow veterans, and if so, who?
So one of my closest friends who ended up going to work for Blackwater, Matt, he was a chief warrant officer. He and I, we stay in touch. Dell and I kept in touch for a while, and then he ended up doing another assignment overseas. It fell off the radar. He's a motorcycle cop now in Vegas. Joseph Androwski was another guy. He was a New York cop. So he and I kept in touch for a while. I'd say Matt, and then my friend Andy Taylor, who was just an amazing guy, was adopted as a baby from Korea. His birth name was Young Gun, so I always thought that was kick-ass, Young Gun, awesome, dude. Wish my parents named me Young Gun. So I kept in touch with him, and then funnily, or not so funnily, Andy, I was at Aroma Cafe in 11 or 12, working on an article, a Veteran Ally article, my first big peer-reviewed article that I wrote, and these emails started coming in from guys I had served with, Andy and Matt and some others, and they said, like, hey man, isn't that messed up about Dorner? And I'm like, what? And so I was like, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, where have you been? Like, check the news. And I went to MSN, and it was all over the news that Chris Dorner, who we had served with, big black guy, real jovial, nice dude, had killed, he was a LAPD cop who got fired. Do you remember when that happened? And he ended up killing like 3 or 4 people, manhunt, and he was on the run, and then they finally got him cornered in, was it Bear Lake in California, and set the place on fire, and he killed himself. But that kind of blew me away. That I knew this dude for a year, and there are pictures of him sitting on my lap and us being silly, and then to see him now in this way. So yeah, that was kind of a strange thing.
Are you a member of any veterans organizations, and if so, which?
I was a member of the VFW, and I was a member of the Military Officers Association of America. I'm just not a joiner, and I love what I do here, but, my long-term ambition is not to work with veterans. I kind of fell into this role, but I definitely have aspirations to work more with, all students. Maybe as a dean of students at some point, or like a vice chancellor of student affairs, but I liked it, but it was primarily older folks, older dudes, really, and some of those guys, because of, the military was just so important to them, or they were in Vietnam, and it was so traumatic. It's like the military is their whole focus. And for me, I sometimes wake up and forget I was in the military. And I'm not just saying that. I'm kind of like, wow, did that really happen? Like, I love it. I respect it. One of the best decisions of my life. But I moved on from it. And so I just didn't really, particularly in my work, in dealing with so much military here, I just didn't want in my off time to overwhelm myself and just be fully inundated with military.
What have you done since separating from the military?
Finished my last bit of education, and I got hired here a month later. So I've been here for almost 7 years doing my thing.
So you were at UC Davis, you got a doctorate degree from
Yep.
UC Davis.
Yep.
And then you came to the University of Illinois. What were you doing before you became the director of the Veterans Center?
So I was assistant dean of students. I was an emergency dean. So I did all the crisis management of the stuff on campus here. I did that for almost 4 years, and then I started the Veterans Office, the one that Jason oversees now. It was a split role, and they had hired me to, my primary job was to be emergency dean and then to start the veterans program here. And as that was, building and growing, Tanya Gallagher from AHS pulled me aside and said, hey, I'm doing this center, would you be interested? And I thought, at that time I was like, I think I'm not going to be in Illinois for that long. So I was kind of like, well, I think I'm going to move back to California. And then I got kind of pulled in doing more work and more projects, and, more publications started coming, and, conference presentations and things just started to really accelerate. And so I formally came over here about 3 years ago.
Okay. As a veteran, have you used your local library? Why or why not?
I go to the Urbana Free Library quite a bit. It's a great place to study. They got awesome coffee. They've got great movies. And I don't know, there's something about being in a library I enjoy. I like being around books. I like the way they smell.
What's the experience been like at Urbana Free as a veteran? I mean, has there been veteran programming or things that, as a veteran, you're like, oh, this is pretty cool, or this is horrible, or indifferent?
I've actually done events with both Champaign and Urbana. I've been on panels. I've given presentations. Phil Clay, who wrote Redeployment, which was a really successful. In fact, Barack Obama mentioned it as like one of the best books of the year when he was reading it, and Phil Clay came and spoke. I was invited to be on a panel with him, but I was at Fort Knox at the time, but one of my students, Christian, got to be a part of that. So, to me, this community, but the libraries are very pro-veteran, and they're very pro, like, how do we promote more visibility about veterans in the community, and what should we look at? And part of that has led to the discussion of, we don't want everything to always go back to trauma. Another veteran commits suicide, another veteran comes back with PTSD. Very important, but not the whole story. And I think that libraries are uniquely positioned to bring the community together and to bring a deeper awareness of all those layers, so that things don't just get stuck and we just keep perpetuating stereotype after stereotype.
As a veteran, are there programs or types of books available at the library that you enjoy more than others?
Can't think of any. I actually don't check out any books from the library, so I mainly just hang out there and get movies, and I buy my books, I donate my books to the library. So, and to the prison literacy project. That's usually where my books go.
As a veteran, is there something that you wish you could change about the library that would enhance your enjoyment of it?
I would like to see more programming through libraries to do visibility. And, I'm biased because of what we do. I would like to see more of that just in general. I think it's important. I think that libraries are spaces where communities gather, and particularly people who are on lower incomes. And I think that what I love about libraries is they're not based on socioeconomic status, and so they really serve as just a wonderful conduit to, provide people with books, to provide people with gathering space, but then to also provide people with programming.
So you said you want to see more programs. What does that look like? Is that like special movie nights? Is that discussion groups, book reading clubs, like making fairs for veterans? Like what does that look like in your world?
I'm a firm believer of revisiting these things through work groups of people. And so you and I did the Symbols of Service, and that was very well received and very powerful. And then we might say, okay, let's tweak this a little bit now and focus on this. And so I think that there's an evolution to these topics, and I'd like to see more of a progression, so that there is, when you look back over 5 years or 10 years at a library, you see that they've attack's not the right word, that they've addressed a topic, but they've done it from several different ways and points. So that when you talk about veterans, you don't always talk about tattoos, right? You might talk about trauma and death and war and, you know, this and that. We brought in this piece about tattoos, and part of that was the stories behind those tattoos and the symbols and what they represent. To me, that's very powerful, and so I would like to see more of a unified approach to taking some of these very broad concepts and revisiting them from a couple of different angles.
How did your military or wartime experiences affect your life?
Good question. I think that it's made me a very patient person. It's really taught me to work with different groups of people and what they bring, you know, whether it's here at the U of I or community veterans or students. The leadership and management training for officers in the Coast Guard is top notch. So I think it really taught me, like, you know, facilitation skills, public speaking skills. I think that it just gave me a deep appreciation. I mean, as cliche as it sounds, a deep appreciation for what we have in America, which it's so easy to take for granted. And then you go into a foreign environment and you see how, you know, some people live, and it's like, my God, you know, this is a whole other planet over here. And so it really gave me just a deep appreciation for what we have, but then also what I have specifically in my life.
What are some of the life lessons you learned from your military service?
I think it's so important that I'm always pushing myself in some way. There's so many exciting things that to learn, to see, to experience, and you know, I think that for me to ever say, like, wow, I'm bored, it's kind of like I'm going to have to really check in with myself. And so it really taught me that there's just this whole vibrant, exciting world that's also very tragic and brutal, and that taught me a lot of respect. You know, you got to respect that. I respect that there are people walking around outside who have seen things and done things that are very hard for me to even comprehend. I also see how veterans are deified in America. I see how veterans manipulate and use the quote-unquote throw the veteran card and, you know, try to use it for personal gain or try to one-up the VA so that they can get money. So it's just really kind of opened my eyes to just the whole spectrum, you know. If somebody were to say, well, what is a veteran? You know, what does it mean to be a human being? How do you answer that?
How has your military service impacted your feelings about war and about the military in general?
I've been against the war in the Middle East since it started. I think it's a totally, I hate to say it like this, but I just think it's a total waste. I think that very little good has come from our involvement in the Middle East. I think that, again, going back to cliches, the people that declare war are not the people who fight in wars, and rarely are they the ones that have loved ones in it. I think we need to use more discretion as human beings before we go to war. I personally think the last justifiable war was World War II. I think since then it's just been bullshit and political agendas and greed and manipulation of power. And feeling that way, even when I was overseas, you know, someone might say, well, you know, isn't that, you know, how do you do something if deep down in your heart you feel it's wrong? Because I still feel that in all of these experiences, there's always opportunities to be honorable and to bring, dare I say it, love and kindness and integrity to whatever it is, whether it's the U of I and all of our horrible corruption, because there's tons of corruption at the U of I, or whether it's in, you know, a war space. It's really looking at it and saying, you know what, the political noise is not my issue because I can't control it. What I can control are these 30 guys that I'm responsible for. What I can control is how I conduct myself. I can control my own integrity, my own honor, and hopefully that protection. So I think that it really taught me how to go into spaces where you see things around you that frustrate you, that irritate you, that piss you off, but that still give you a purpose and a mission to say, but I'm going to invest my time here. I'd say just in general with war, and being in, other countries that I've backpacked through, like Cambodia, and, the devastation of the Khmer Rouge and stuff like that, my job as an educator in its fullness is how do I give young people tools to live more vibrant lives and to be of service? And, can we at some point in our existence as a humanity start to move beyond war? I don't know, but I'd like to think that we have it in us to do so.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will hear this interview?
If you're thinking about joining the military, do it. Everybody can give you their spin on, talk to 9, 10 veterans and you're going to get 9 to 10 different versions. I think that the military, like all jobs, it has its gold and it has its shadows. And to me, it's just one of the more unique places to find yourself. You have to give up some things. Can't smoke weed. I'm from Colorado. Doesn't matter. Can't in the military. Believe it or not, there's even through the Uniform Code of Military Justice, there's sexual positions that are outlawed in the military. Now, of course, they're not enforced, but it just goes to show you that you are entering a very different world with different rules. And part of that is you have to sacrifice certain things. But with all that said, I think that, the hero's journey for me, it was that call to adventure, that call to the unknown, and go for it, go for it.
Is there anything else you feel like we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview, and if so, what?
I think it goes back to that deifying or deification of the warrior or the military, which is not just in American culture, that I think that veterans are symbols of stories that we as a humanity clutch onto because we need them. And so it's like we need to think of people performing in heroic ways to keep ourselves and to keep our culture balanced. And so when we watch films and, Star Wars, and you see Luke Skywalker and he's conflicted with all of these emotions and he's confronting, his shit, right? He's face to face with his shit and he has to perform. We need those stories. And I think that veterans in many ways are the symbols of the preservation of those stories for a lot of people. And that's why when somebody comes back from war, it's very common for civilians to think that they've been in the most horrible of circumstances and that they've performed in heroic ways, almost because we need that. But the reality is that it's a job. It's a hodgepodge of people, the good, the bad, the ugly, the criminal, the altar boy, the altar girl, all this stuff. It's just a complex environment. But I think that outside looking in, there is a deification that we definitely do. And I'm not saying that's wrong, it's just an observation.
Gotcha. Yeah. When were you in at Kuwait in Iraq?
06, 07. Yeah.
Okay.
Got there in early August and left in late May. Yeah, because I was back for my birthday. That's right.
Anything else?
That's it.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, cool.